the AIA and the early AIA, but there is the Architects Institute of America, the AIA. So if you are here to hear a talk about architecture, this might not be the lecture that you're looking for. We seem to be running into that every once in a while, but the AIA has been here in Spokane for 75 years. In fact, we are celebrating our 75th anniversary this year. I'll mention in a few minutes our gala, which is our celebratory dinner that we'll be having in May. And I hope for some of you, we might think about coming. It should be a really wonderful evening. But for now, let's just do a little bit of introductory things here, including myself. My name is Andy Goldman. I'm a professor at Gonzaga University. I'm an archaeologist, and I'm the president of the Spokane Society. We are doing hybrid talks this year. We've gotten some great feedback about that. We seem to have it down now, thanks to board member Cindy Bell and the folks here at the museum. We're always grateful to the museum for its support for our program. We do this on the third Thursday of the month. And so we'll have 2 more talks in March and April, and I'll say something about that shortly. But this talk is a live presentation, and recording it is strictly prohibited. The AIA respects the intellectual property of its presenters and asks the viewers to do the same. We thank you for your cooperation. The AIA is starting a new tradition, which is new to us, I should say, although not to many groups here in the Spokane area. And we would like to begin this evening with a land acknowledgement to acknowledge, well, we would like to honor the original people of the lands on which we stand by recognizing this as the traditional homeland territory of the Spokane tribe. Their presence here since time immemorial can be seen and felt within these museum walls and the surrounding landscapes. With gratitude, we would like to extend a thank you to the Spokanes, past, present, and future, for sharing this space as a place for artistic and cultural expressions to be enjoyed by all. And we'll continue to do this now as part of our lecture series.
I saw a big thing in the middle and you can't see it.
That's what's.
Oh, we have some voices coming out here. This is from our hybrid. So occasionally some people leave their microphones on. We'll get to it. If you are listening to us online, you could please hit your mute button. We would appreciate that. And in fact, if any of you here in the audience have the ringer on your phone, this would be a great time to turn that off as well. We make archaeology happen, and we have since 1879. We are a volunteer group. We are serving the community in a variety of ways. We support archaeologists, educators, excavators, publications, research, site preservation. All of this falls within the mission of the AIA, which in 3 simple words is excavate, educate, and advocate. We have a Facebook page, which we've been using over a number of years, but we've actually moved away from Facebook. And we want to be sure that everybody understands that we now have a new specially made AIA web page. Our thanks to Brian Buchanan on our board at EWU, who set this up. We're now going to use this as our central hub for archaeologically oriented talks, our society, yes, but also to provide resources on the community and archaeological activities and so forth taking place around Spokane. So we're hoping that you'll write this down or take a note. We'll be using this more and more frequently to get information to you, including information about our upcoming gala dinner. We are also, thanks to Cindy Bell, posting a number of our lectures, not all of them. Sometimes we don't get permission to do so, but we do want to put up as many of these as we can so that you can, should you not be able to be here tonight, go and take a look at the lecture. So some of them will be there, others not. And we're always grateful to the speakers when they agree to let us post these. It's a YouTube page, easy to find. Just go to YouTube and Google Spokane AIA, and you'll find some of our past lectures starting last year already up there and available for viewing. The AIA, like many other societies, is beginning to adapt to this virtual world. And what we understand is that there are many wonderful speakers across the globe who simply can't make it to Spokane. We're not a hub, I think, as most of you know, but that's not going to slow the AIA down. And this year they began a wonderful series called the Archeology Hour Lectures. They're just 1 hour. They're exactly an hour. And they're mostly on Tuesdays or occasionally on Wednesdays. And we encourage you to join. You just register. It's free. You go online to www.archeological.org and find the correct page. The next one coming is going to be Tuesday, March 14th, which will be 2 days before our next lecture here. And that'll be called Collision of Worlds, an archaeological perspective on the Spanish invasion of Aztec Mexico, which sounds like it's going to be a fascinating talk. These lectures, again, are free. They're online, and you can just hop on. They start at 7 p.m. in the evening for us West Coasties, which is wonderful. They actually do them twice, one for the East Coast and one for the West Coast. The AIA is being very mindful that we have a different schedule. So it's an evening lecture, kind of like this, and we encourage you to join those. Finally, our 75th Anniversary Gala. For those of you who have not heard about this, there is a sheet out there with information on the table, and we encourage you to take one or to check out our AIA Society website. We are celebrating our 75th anniversary, and that will take place on the evening of Saturday, May 6th, out in the Valley. We are looking forward to an evening of wonderful food and a dinner. The theme is the excavation in 1957 of the Midas tumulus, the so-called Midas tumulus, the Great Tumulus, at the ancient site of Gordian in central Turkey. I'm a team member. I've worked at Gordian for over 20 years, and I know a lot of the people, including Dr. Richard Liebhardt, who will be coming from North Carolina to give us a talk on the tomb. He is the expert. And I have to say, I've had many tours from the inside the tomb, which is an experience that I think everybody should have. But equally, we'll be having a dinner which recreates some of the food, the types of food that was actually eaten at the funerary meal. And then we will follow that with an evening lecture talking about the excavation of the tomb. And the finds and the most recent discoveries. Richard, for example, was up on the roof one day and he looked down and there was a beam of wood. He saw just the right light and he realized that there were a whole bunch of Phrygian names carved into it. We're still learning about this amazing find. It was an intact tomb dating to the late 8th century, probably the father of King Midas. Maybe Gordius, we call him. It's an interesting story, and we hope that you'll be able to join us for this dinner. The dinner will be $65 per person. The AIA Society is actually supporting a lot of this. It's not a fundraiser, it's just a celebratory dinner, but seats are beginning to go fast. And if this is something you're interested in, I would encourage you to sign up soon. Our lecture upcoming in March is a bit of a change from what we had originally had. Our March speaker, who was going to talk about the voyages of Magellan, which I'm very excited about, had to put us off until April. So we swapped our lectures. And so the March lecture is now speaking in April and the April's lecture is now speaking in March. So same talks, just different months. And so we're very, very pleased to have Dr. Christine Johnston from Western Washington speaking about ancient Egypt, which is her specialty, in merchants and markets in Egyptian trade. That'll be on the third Thursday of March. That'll be March 16th. And that'll be here at the museum, as well as hybrid like this talk. And finally, our speaker this evening, Dr. Randall, or Randy Souza, is at Seattle University. I met him several years ago, and I marked him out as a victim to drag him out here to Spokane in the middle of the winter. Actually, it's not so bad, and to have him speak. He's actually going to be speaking on some material that I had the pleasure to work with, but don't know very well. So I'm personally very excited about this. Dr. Souza is a professor now, has been 6 years at Seattle University. He did his undergraduate in classics at Amherst College on the East Coast, and he did his PhD at California State Berkeley, which he received in 2014. His interests lie in human mobility and group dynamics in the ancient Mediterranean, and his research focuses on Sicily as a site of particularly significant interactions, being located where it is, and the numbers of civilizations which have swirled around this amazing island. I hope many of you have had a chance to go. He works at Morgantina, which is a sort of a premier legacy American site with some wonderful finds there. And he's preparing a manuscript on Sicilian mobility and citizenship in the 4th and 3rd centuries. Is that one done? Getting there. Anyways, his talk this evening is entitled Survival and Resilient Communities in Ancient Sicily, The Lessons of Entella. Please welcome Dr. Randy Souza.
Thank you, Andy, for that great introduction. Thank you to the Spokane Society for such a warm introduction and welcome. Now, my lecture tonight will focus on the experience of an ancient community that suffered expulsion from its home in the face of a superior military force. And as you all know, history often repeats itself. A moment's reflection on how we come to be here today would bring together all of our individual itineraries, of course, our family trajectories, and it would also confront a history of violence and dispossession, expulsions from homes by superior military forces that have shaped and continue to shape the human landscape in which we live. In this part of Washington State, the Spokane people, as Andy mentioned, and other indigenous polities were made to yield to the United States, and not all that long ago. To us students of ancient history, a century and a half is a pretty short time. Tonight, we will also see how an ancient community maintained its sense of belonging while in exile. It found allies, it was able to return home again and begin communal life. These things are happening today too, to one degree or another, as indigenous people in and outside of formal nations work to maintain cultural heritage, enlist allies, and yes, seek a share of resources, including land, with which to thrive. Now, I'm here tonight to introduce to you the ancient Sicilian city of Entella, to explain how its inhabitants averted destruction, not to judge any actors involved, and least of all, to tell you what to do or think or make of it. But if tonight we find ourselves rooting for the survival of this little town, Entella, or not, or if we cheer the Roman decision and commitment to resettling them rather than extinguishing them, or not, then we might well reflect on that response. The dynamics that we see at play in ancient Sicily are not abstract curiosities of history, but part of a very present past. In the first, so here, this is the primer, I think you're supposed to say. In the First Punic War, Roman and Carthaginian armies fought for control of Sicily. Perhaps you know this. Like many other communities, the inhabitants of the small city-state of Entella were caught between those two sides. In the course of the war, we learn that the people of Entella were expelled from their city, and it was probably by the Romans. Eventually, probably at the end of the war, a critical portion of these refugees managed to return to Entella and restart the life of their community, thanks to a network of benefactors. And the fact that their community had survived because of this network did not escape their notice. And in fact, they thanked their benefactors in ways particularly geared toward strengthening what had supported them. As a city-state, they passed a series of decrees, official decrees that described what the assistance that they had received, expressed their thanks for it, and then extended privileges that I argue, and others have pointed out too, they encourage greater interaction in order to bind them all together into what I would consider a more expansive community of people who sacrifice and celebrate and enjoy spectacle together. The growing strength of this network also led to other cities which had rendered assistance in an earlier conflict to send a reminder of these previous alliances to the people of Entella, who also passed decrees for them too. So it's, I think we see others wanting to join the party and get in on it. The people of Entella inscribed these decrees in Greek on bronze tablets for public display. And that's the only reason we know about this historical event, because no other written source says anything about what happened at Entella during the First Punic War. Now, this talk, which draws on an article that will be published soon, proceeds in 4 sections. In the first, I'll briefly situate my research on Entella within broader academic conversations in which it participates, and discuss the unfortunate provenance of the Entella tablets. In the second, I'll provide some historical and archaeological background on the city and its inhabitants, taking us to the verge of the expulsion and the episode we'll be discussing. Third, we'll discuss and look at what the decrees actually tell us about the threat to the community's existence and the steps taken by benefactors to ensure its survival. Then in the last section, I'll show how the people of Entella drew on a well-established diplomatic discourse current in the Hellenistic period Mediterranean, combining different types of grants in a holistic program to reinforce their relationships with their network of friendly communities. Displacement, especially during wartime, was a fairly common occurrence in the ancient Mediterranean world, and ancient diaspora communities were often quite widespread. So some examples you might recall from history are the Athenians, who famously evacuated their population to Troezen and Salamis during the Achaemenid invasion in 480 BC. All the dates will be BCE. In that part of the world, the Plataeans also were frequently on the run, living among friendly hosts in Athens and elsewhere. In Sicily, too, wartime evacuations in the 5th century put tens of thousands, if not more, in motion over the island. And so did mass enslavements and the mass movements of political exiles. Most of the time, when a community was dispersed, it dissolved forever, and we never hear of them again. But there are examples of groups who survive. Entella is one of them. 2 others of Sicily that I've studied before illustrate some of the challenges of this exile experience, this diaspora experience. The people of Naxos in eastern Sicily were collectively enslaved by the Syracusan tyrant Dionysus in 403 BCE, but they show up in our records a little more than 10 years later as settlers in a foundation venture supported by another city-state, Rhegion, at the toe of Italy, a perennial opponent of Dionysus, by the way. But this attempted new settlement failed. The Naxians dispersed again, until a generation later in 358-7, they were collected by another unknown man, Andromachos, who we wouldn't really know of unless he was also the father of the historian Timaeus, who's mostly lost but preserved in fragments. So we have this example of a community surviving thanks to the intervention of allies. Around the same time, actually, the people and the inhabitants of Carthaginian Motia on the western edge of Sicily were also enslaved en masse by Dionysius, but they also found paths out of enslavement and were able to establish, with the support of the central Carthaginian state in North Africa, a new city, Lilybaeum, and we'll meet Lilybaeum shortly. What these and other cases show is that a community under threat requires the active intervention and support of friendly jurisdictions if the community is going to survive as a meaningful group. In other words, even if the individuals survive, the group may not. For the group to survive, others have to help. Now, current work on more modern displacements and diasporas illuminates and invigorates the study of these phenomena in antiquity. Take, for example, Edward Said in a reflective essay from 2000. He says, the exile knows that in a secular and contingent world, homes are always provisional. Borders and barriers which enclose us within the safety of familiar territory can also become prisons and are often defended beyond reason or necessity. Exiles cross borders and break barriers of thought and experience. Tension between the cohesion of the diaspora community and assimilation in the host community is hardly surprising, but recent studies emphasize both the diverse experiences of groups pulled in several directions, as well as the difficulties caused by discontinuous and diffuse concentrations of citizens. What seems to be a universal in such cases is the particularly fraught assumption of various identities by diaspora groups within a host community. For exiles out of their home territory, the shifting and contextual affiliation with several possible groups assumes a greater importance than it does for long settled residents who don't have to ask who they are and why they're where they are. To be sure, such scholarly attention, the recent scholarly attention to questions of international migration and diasporas is aimed at building frameworks of understanding economic performance, typologies of refugee movement, and even forms of modern community that are specific to the modern world. However, I think they are still, as I said, illuminating and invigorating. One of the major interventions of the critical refugee critical refugee studies, a subfield led and maybe we could say founded by Yen Le Espiritu in the context of 20th century Vietnamese experience, is to emphasize the conflicting loyalties, painful memories, and difficult cultural choices that refugees face. Espiritu also reminds us with Said that refugees rarely, if ever, know their final destinations, but they can move and be moved in a contingent existence for very long periods of time. And all these challenges are likely to have characterized diaspora communities in the past, even though nobody or hardly anybody was recording what it was like to live through. This is one of the major exceptions we'll be seeing. Now, the ancient evidence that we do possess does not always come in an ideal form or via an ideal path. The Entella tablets were sadly not discovered in controlled archaeological excavation, but were pulled from the soil, perhaps beginning as early as the 1940s, and they came to the attention of scholars principally through the antiquities market. In addition to 7 tablets from Entella, which we will see later in the talk, there's also one from a nearby, but not precisely identified city named as Nakone, which deals in fascinating detail with the resolution of stasis, civil conflict. And this is not apparently related in any way to the episode at Entella, but it is on its own a really fascinating document. Careful analysis of the corrosion patterns of the Entella tablets and the Nakone tablet, which you see here in the background, the big square one is the Nakone tablet. They were all evidently stored together, as we can see from corrosion patterns. So the general hypothesis is that at one point in time, they were all stored together, perhaps after they were taken down from their places of display. The genuine tablets were dispersed on the antiquities market between Switzerland, Britain, and the United States. One false modern forgery was added to that collection, but weeded out. And 3 were returned to Italy in the 1990s, but the others, while they've been documented to varying degrees, remain in unknown private hands today. I suspect some people know where they are, but I don't. The urban center of Entella is located on a gypsum-rich plateau, approximately 2 or 3 kilometers south of the Belice Sinistro River, the ancient Chrymissos River. A later tradition links the foundation of Entella by an eponymous hero, Entellus, big surprise, to the Trojans and then thereby to the Romans. This tradition was elaborated by later Roman authors, Silius Italicus in the first place, and by medieval Scholius, but it does little to illuminate the reality of the earliest occupation of the site in the Bronze Age. So we really don't know how people thought of themselves in the Bronze Age and the early Iron Age. Still, Entella lies in the Western Sicilian territory. So Entella is right about there. And the Western Sicilian territory generally agreed to have been inhabited before the arrival of Punic populations, Carthaginian, Phoenician populations, and Greeks, a territory inhabited by the Elyminians, an indigenous group who these newcomers found when they arrived in Sicily in the 8th century BCE. And the name Elymian it's been etymologized in various ways, but they never call themselves Elymian in any document we have. Thucydides calls them Elymians, so we call them Elymians. Modern scholars are able to identify Elymians through language and through the written accounts of Greek and Roman authors, and also, I should say, through material culture in extremely nuanced readings of ceramic typologies that I don't pretend to understand completely, but I believe. While the precise meaning of this ethnic term, Elymian, continues to be debated and refined in scholarship, And while the boundaries between Greek and Elimian must have been rather fuzzy in this context, as they're often not as neat as we might like them to be, for our purposes, Entella can be considered to have an Elimian origin. The archaic city is known primarily, but not exclusively, through funerary archaeological evidence, not particularly well preserved, and political and social life in this period is fairly obscure. So I'm going to pass over into the 5th century. Evidence in the 5th century is a lot more abundant, but still a little bit patchy, but some of it attests the existence of a coherent political community. 2 monumental buildings in the form of oikoi, or sort of houses, large houses, one with an ashlar retaining wall and both with circular platform altars, were constructed in the area that would become the city's Agra at the beginning of the 5th century BCE. They're preserved rather poorly, and they're below later construction that we'll look at in just a moment. They've been interpreted as shrines to Demeter and Kore, or perhaps Hestia. So Hestia will figure in the Entella tablets, so worth keeping in mind. Attic imports black figure pottery begins in the 2nd quarter of the 5th century BCE and continues through the end of the century. And also in terms of representing a political community, or a community representing itself, it's also in the 2nd half of the 5th century that the people of Entella begin minting coins in silver, also bronze, with figures that are presumably deities. These are the first written references to the community as Entella. This place is Entella. They're written in a Greek alphabet. And so we have a picture, it's a spotty one, but we have a picture of the 5th century Entella, an Elimian origin city using the Greek language, maintaining some kind of a Sicilian cult, if it is in fact Demeter and Kore, shared in that case with the Greek communities on the East Coast, and minting coins, importantly, on a weight standard, the litra, with a nominal weight around 12 grams, also shared with the Greeks. So there's a possibility of trade links that are being documented here. But at the end of the 5th century, the city came to be controlled by a group of Campanians who show up in our sources as mercenaries. Though it's worth keeping in mind that just because a literary source calls a group of people mercenaries doesn't mean that's the only thing that they did. There might have been a lot of violence. There might have been a little bit less, and there are reasons to be a little bit skeptical of what is sometimes a kind of sensational account. But based on the accounts of Diodorus Siculus, we can reconstruct the travels of 800 Campanian mercenaries originally hired by the people of Catane and Naxos after the failure of the Athenian expedition. You see on this map, you see movements out of Syracuse, where they would have been fighting on behalf of the Athenians, later garrisoned by the Carthaginians at Entella in western Sicily, over here. Later fighting for the Greeks and then for the Carthaginians. They switched sides at Agragas down here in 406, returning to eastern Sicily under the command of Dionysus, that tyrant we met just before, and then finally being dismissed by him and going to Entella in 404. Diodorus describes a violent seizure in 404, but he's the only source. And it's been plausibly argued that his timeline is compressed and that he may be exaggerating the brutality of the episode, but it's still worth addressing. So here's Diodorus. Dionysius, this tyrant, managed benevolently the exiles who had returned because he wanted them to encourage others and also to return to their homeland. This is about Syracusan exiles. Okay, but after honoring the Campanians, these mercenaries, with the proper gifts, i.e. paying them what he owed them, he dismissed them from the city because he was suspicious of their instability. And he might well be, they had switched sides in a battle in Agragas. They went to Entella, and after persuading those in the city to take them in as joint inhabitants, they made an attack at night and killed the adult men. Then they married the wives of the men whose trust they had violated. Now, this has been critiqued, or this passage has been read in a couple of different ways. Yes, reading it on its face, but also reading it in context of the seizure of Messana, also by South Italian mercenaries around the death of Agathocles in 289, 288. And so it's been suggested that Diodorus is writing in the 1st century BCE, so centuries after this episode, and it's been suggested that the image of the Campanian takeover was retrojected onto what may well have been a slower mixture of peoples, even if, yes, Campanian mercenaries were stationed at Entella, they may not have got control of the city this way. It's hard to say. And interestingly, it's at Entella, during the years when the Campanians were initially stationed there, that the Carthaginians are generally agreed to have operated their very first mint. That's another story. We'll talk about that another time. The first coins issued by the Campanians in Entella at the end of the 5th century were actually overstrikes of Greek silver drachmae and hemidrachmae using the running horse you see over here, and the Pegasus. These are connected to both Punic and also Greek types at the same time. Sometimes accompanied by the legend Entellus and a helmet, sometimes with the legend Campanon, and you see it on both of these, right? So you have Entella with an unknown female deity, and the Kappa Campanon around the side, and here it's reversed, right? You have Entella on the side, on the reverse, sorry, and you have Campanon in pretty sketchy letters on the head's side. Now, to judge from the material evidence, Entella's operation as a political community appears to have continued without hiatus in this takeover. And there's no evidence in the material record of anything like the violence that Diodorus describes. In addition to the more diffuse evidence of continued burials, in one of the necropolis, Necropolis A, archaeologists have identified 2 adjacent burials dating to the first half of the 4th century with material connections to Campanian mercenary work. They're T149, Tomb 149, and 150. 149 is a man buried with a bronze belt similar to those found in Italic burials, and a spear blade indicating some kind of military connection. Interestingly, osteological analysis, again, I have to take the word of experts, suggests where on the inside of the femurs, consistent with lots of horse riding, and also where on the shoulder, consistent with using a spear. Now, I don't know how much of that might be coincidence, but it's interesting nonetheless. Tomb 150, you see on the it's not mirrored. Okay, the right side of the screen is a woman buried with an iron fibula at her neck, maybe where there used to be the garment, but it's decorated with coral, and you see the coral attachment here. Coral is almost unknown in Sicily in this period, but it does appear in Campanian jewelry of the late 5th century. These are the only burials known to exhibit such Italic influences, and they raise interesting questions about ethnic identity, relationship between these 2 individuals that can't be fully answered with the evidence that we have, though again, they suggest some kind of continuing Campanian connection. The Agra at Entella, and here you see it's only been very partially excavated on the kind of the northeastern side. This is a long building we'll see in just a moment in plan. In this period saw a new monumental building activity with a large granary built next to the Oikos sanctuary around 300, and all now. A foundation deposit of figurines and pottery found under the northwest corner of this Oikos, where it meets the older structure, suggests an intentional continuity of the 5th century cult into the early Hellenistic period. So if I can undo that, right? These are the oldest buildings, and the granary was apparently added on. Very typical granary structure with regular rectangular rooms, sort of in a long linear arrangement. In the necropolis too, burials of the later 4th century and early 3rd century are relatively abundant. This is clearly if not flourishing, certainly an inhabited city continuing in existence. Ceramics recovered from both tombs and from the excavations in the Agra include imports from southern Italy and eastern Sicily, the famous Pagenstecher Lekythoi and Sicilian red figure pieces, probably from around the area of Syracuse. Also local productions of tableware, transport vessels in abundance, suggesting a relatively large community. For the first time at the end of the 4th century, so around 300, We have again Entella minting its own coins, and the issues of this period are a little bit more detailed than the previous overstrikes. Here again, you can see the remnants of Entella around the obverse and Campanon around the reverse. Outside the city, a field survey of Entella's territory has demonstrated that most rural sites either flourished or emerged for the first time between the end of the 4th century and the beginning of the 3rd. Now, with the outbreak of the First Punic War, the population of Entella might well have considered themselves to be in a fairly good position. Little did they know. The Carthaginians were now a known quantity, whatever understanding they had struck with them. Entella had made some arrangement of taxes or tribute, or at least not rebellion. Neither Syracuse nor any other Greek city appeared to be particularly interested in ruling Western Sicily, though they did go on campaigns against the Carthaginians there. With the Romans, meanwhile, Entella shared both an Italic origin, like the Mamertines in Messana, on whose behalf the Romans had crossed the island in the first place. And they also had a Trojan Illyrioman connection, like Egesta, nearby Egesta. So here, Segesta, sometimes spelled with an E, sometimes not, but Entella is just about maybe at the G of Egesta, of Segesta. You can see that. Segesta was the main Illyrioman city from the Archaic period onward, and that's a community that certainly joined the Roman side very early in the war, probably in 263. Given Polybius's statement that Mamertines did appeal to Italic kinship with the Romans while under Syracusan siege, and fairly convincing arguments that Segesta referred to its Trojan Illyrioman kinship when it made its deal with Rome, it would be very odd indeed if the potential value of kinship diplomacy were lost on the people of Entella, since they had these two avenues to connect to the new military force. But there's no positive sign of this being the case. Now, briefly and in broad strokes, the war proceeded in stages of growing but not uncontested Roman control of Sicily. So in 263, they defeated a Syracusan army in northeastern Sicily, and the Syracusan king, Huron II, became a loyal client. In 262, they captured Agra on the south coast. After suffering naval defeats on the north coast and elsewhere, they won a signal victory at Mylae in 260. In 254, they sacked Panormus, one of the last remaining Carthaginian cities, and not long after that secured control of virtually the whole of the island except for the Carthaginian fortress city of Lilybaeum, right, which we had mentioned was founded by the survivors of Motia. So Lilybaeum is not located on this map, but it's just south of Motia. One remarkable piece of epigraphic evidence, inscriptions, an inscription attesting the administrative interests and intervention of the Roman state in Western Sicily is a milestone signed by the Roman Gaius Aurelius Cotta, who was consul in 252 and 248, found in the territory of modern Corleone, not far from Entella at all, and measuring the distance in Roman miles from Agragas. It's 57 Roman miles from Agragas, and it's found, roughly there-ish. Presumably, this is a road leading from there to Panormus, but maybe into the Illyrioman interior. It's hard to say. In any case, to finish out the war narrative, the Roman victory, naval victory off the Agates Islands, 242, demonstrated that the Carthaginians would not be able to keep the inhabitants of Lilybaeum alive much longer, and they negotiated a treaty that eventually required them to withdraw from Sicily, leaving the Romans in control of everything except for Syracuse. And again, Huron II was a loyal client. All right, so let's now take a look at the decrees themselves to see what the people of Entella have to tell us about their experience. And here on this slide, you see the layout of the inscriptions. I have photos I can show later if people want. Zoomed in photos. As I mentioned, right, only 3 of them have actually returned to Italy and been able to be photographed anytime this century, frankly. The others depend on photographs and facsimiles and just drawings made mostly in the early 80s. And here's the modern forgery and the Nicone tablet set off here. So there are 7 genuine decrees, and let's look at what they say. All right, so Entella A1 is the longest, and it thanks a series of communities for rendering assistance in grain. So if you'll indulge me, I'm going to read it, and we'll see if it generates questions. So this decree reads, in the archonship, the leadership of Artemidorus, son of Aeolus, and Gnaeus, son of Oppios. Interestingly, a combination of Greek names and clearly italic names, right? Gnaeus is even a Roman one. On the first day of Panamos, a nice Rhodian month, since some of the cities gave assistance toward the resettlement of the city with grain, and some gave it as a gift to the city, while others delivered it as a loan, and they demonstrated great goodwill to the people of Entella, and they created an abundance of grain in place of a shortage, the council decided that as many of the cities as helped with grain or money or anything else for the resettlement of the city, they're to have goodwill and potential citizenship, that is the right of taking on citizenship at Entella, with the people of Entella for all time, and that they may invite it to our games, and that they will have first row seats, and that the private individuals who gave the utmost assistance to the city with grain for our resettlement are to be proxenoi, a kind of a combination of an honorary citizen and ambassador, with the city of Entella, both themselves and their children. The assembly agreed, the assembly also decided. And then we have this list of what they gave. We can come back to this if you want. I won't read this all out. But depending on how you read these, and if you take a look at the Greek text, I'm not sure how easily it's possible to see, but a number of the numerical symbols are not known. We don't know what they say. So there's a kind of a low reading and there's a kind of a high reading. The low reading would suggest, I brought my folder of calculations, anywhere between 280 and maybe 300 people for a year, enough grain to feed about 300 people, let's say, for a year. The high reading is more like 1,100 people or 1,200 people for a year. Hard to tell between the two readings. I'm inclined to go with the higher one, but we don't know. And obviously this bears on the question of how big was this community? How many people lived in the city? Are we talking about citizens, but also families? And as with most kind of ancient demographics, one deals, again, in very broad strokes. It's very hard to get clear data on this. But okay, we'll skip down all the way to the end. The archons are to write this decree up on a bronze plaque and set it up on the council house. Okay, makes sense. Oh, and I'll just point out the fact that this one benefactor, Minatus Corios, is named a Mamertine, is used as dating a criterion to suggest this must be after 288, right? Nobody was calling themselves a Mamertine. People disagree on this a little bit, but nobody's seriously proposed a date outside the First Punic War context for about 30 years. So it may not be totally right, but scholarly consensus seems to be swinging pretty hard into the First Punic War context. That's obviously the one that I favor. All right. Entella A2 is much shorter. The other ones are all much shorter. Okay. And we can skip through them a little bit because they're pretty formulaic. Decree A2. In the archonship of Artemidorus, same prescript, same archons, same day. Since the Enioi, the people of Enna in central Sicily, have always been well disposed toward us, both when we were in our own land and when we fled from our own land and were wandering, they invited and accepted us both in their city and their territory. The council and the council and the assembly decided that there be goodwill and potential citizenship, that is the right for these people to become citizens of Entella, for these people in Enna for all time. The archons are to write this decree up, set it up on the council house. So a lot of the formulas are the same, but here we learn that the people of Enna in central Sicily gave them particular aid, right? A place to stay. And what's also interesting, especially about this document, is it's one of the rare cases, maybe not a unique case in the ancient Mediterranean, but it is one of the very rare cases in which a community, especially a non-imperial community, speaks in the first person about its experience when we fled from our own land, when we were wandering. And so again, even though it's extremely concise, it is nonetheless eloquent documentation of what that experience was like. Moving on to A3, same prescript, same day, same everything. All right, since the Egestaioi, that's the people of Segesta, it sometimes has the sigma, sometimes not. The people of, since the Egestaioi, the people of Segesta, have always been well disposed toward us, both when we were in our own land and when we were thrown out of our own land. It's a different verb. And when many of our citizens were seized from us, both men and women, to the best of their ability, they, i.e. the Egestaioi, the people of Segesta, they helped them so that they could be quickly saved, brought to salvation in their own land. The council and the assembly decided that there'd be goodwill, potential citizenship, et cetera, et cetera. Here again, we learn a couple of things. Yes, we have a variant on being exiles, right? When we were thrown out of our own land. It's a verb that's sometimes used for falling off a horse, for what it's worth. If we go back, exepetimus, expiptimus, sorry, A3. But the other thing that we learn, right, is that people had been enslaved, people had been captured. And the people of Segesta, the Egestaioi, had intervened in some way. What that intervention looks like, they don't tell us. Could that be the people of Egesta purchasing people with the intent of freeing them? Maybe. Could it be the people of Egesta refusing to recognize slave status? That's something that I argued in the case of both Motia, the survivors of Motia, founding Lilybaeum, and the Naxioi, enslaved by Dionysus, and then later attempting to found a city at Mylae, and later actually becoming the citizens of Greek Tauromenion. A jurisdiction simply refusing to acknowledge the enslaved status of people who they wanted to keep as free people. It's not really clear. Likely, there would have been some people, if they were enslaved at Entella in this traumatic moment, they would have found their way into Egesta. It's the nearest big city. But exactly what the people of Egesta had done, unfortunately, we don't know. The second group is just one set, or is just one inscription. And this is another inscription that's used it's used as pretty strong dating criteria. It's also the only one to have an illustration. I don't have a great image, but I could show you later in the exhibition volume. But it has a nice italic helmet, a Montefortino helmet with cheek guards and the 3 plumes. I guess they don't always have 3 plumes. You'll have to ask Andy about that. All right, but anyway, this document talks about a person who is almost certainly an agent of the Roman state. So this one reads, in the archonship of Kippos, son of Sosios, and Theodorus, son of Mamos, even an interesting mix of parents and children with more Greek and more Italic names. Not that that is determinative, as we well know, but it is evocative of a mix of a Hellenic and Italic culture. On the 30th day of Eumenideus, the council decided, since Tiberius Claudius, son of Gaius from Antium, stationed as an epimeletes, which is a Greek term, usually kind of a military commander or a deputy. It's interesting, always someone left behind, in our sources, it's always somebody left behind after a victory to hold on to something that's been conquered or taken. He was stationed as an epimeletes at our city. He provided many and great services to the community and became a benefactor for the resettlement of the city at every opportunity. It was decided that he be a proxenos, right? A combination honorary citizen, sort of ambassador, advocating for their interests. Himself and his children, so that the rest, and from these on, we get these interesting motivation clauses. Why are they doing this? Okay, we're doing this so that the rest may know that our people is able to repay the worthy thanks to its benefactors. The archons would write this decree up and put it on the council house. Sorry, I didn't change that that translation, but the bulletarian is the council house. All right, so what do we learn here? Well, number one, Tiberius Claudius, son of Gaius, pretty much has to be a Roman. And furthermore, he has to be stationed there, not on his own. The Greek word is tachthes, it's a military command. He must have been put there by the Roman state. And this makes sense for a post-First Punic War resettlement effort, right? The Romans were in charge of the island. But okay, what did he do there? Well, it's a little bit vague. And often communities under some kind of military rule, it pays to be vague. He became a benefactor. He provided many great services. He became a benefactor. What exactly this help consists of is left unsaid, maybe intentionally. But conceivably, he could have been there helping with logistics. He could have been there smoothing out any legal issues that the Roman Senate back in Rome might have had with the situation. We don't really know, but he was clearly doing a reasonably good job of not antagonizing them and maybe even actively helping them. So again, exactly what that help is hard to say. But this is this is the document that people point to say, well, this really has to be First Punic War, actually, just after the First Punic War, at the very end of the First Punic War, when there was no longer a Carthaginian threat to the Romans. All right, and then there's a third tranche or a third set. This one has 3 documents, and one of them is, well, the last 2 are these reminders, and we'll get to that. All right, so C1, when Lucius, son of Pacius, was hieronomon, this is an office that we hear of in other contexts, in more religious contexts. In the case of Entella, it may have had a religious meaning, but it's very hard to say. Sometimes in sources, it actually is used as a kind of a general kind of secretary position or something. We wouldn't really think of it as having a religious overtone. In any case, this is the dating formula. Okay, on the 26th day of Humanideos in the month, all right, the assembly decides as well as the council, since in the times before there existed for us potential citizenship with the Ossorinoi, the people of Ossoro, also in central Sicily, close to Enna. And similarly now, while we are resettling our city, they are providing citizens in the present tense. They're providing services to the best of their ability. It was decided that there be for the people of Entella both the potential citizenship with the Ossorinoi, the people of Ossoro, that existed from the beginning, as well as friendship and goodwill. They should also be invited to our games. The archons are to write this up, put it on the temple of Hestia this time, so that there may be a reminder, here's that motivation clause, to posterity of the existing goodwill and potential citizenship with the Ossorinoi. And maybe it's self-evident why this right of potential citizenship at some other place would be valuable to a community under threat, right? If the people of Entella are expelled and they have the option to go to Ossoro and take up this offer, that could be really valuable. There are some oddities in the phrasing here in terms of what the people of Entella are actually decreeing. It seems with the language that they're actually insisting that they continue to have the right of potential citizenship at Ossoro, which they shouldn't really be able to say. And I can talk to you more about why that might be, but they also add friendship, goodwill, invite to the games, and pass a decree, make a bronze tablet. And as I have suggested, and as I'll now show, I think other communities decided that they wanted bronze tablets too. And the first of these is this decree for the people of Herbata, also central eastern Sicily. Same prescript, but okay. The assembly decided, as well as the council, we start here, since when we previously inhabited this city and the war against the Carthaginians had begun, the Herbatae, the people of Herbata, helped our city and were faithful to the oath. And similarly now, when we are inhabiting our city and they are making it clear to us that they remember the friendship and the goodwill toward us, it was decided to write on a bronze plaque and set up on the temple of Hestia the goodwill and alliance existing for us with the people of Herbata, and that they be invited to the games and to sacrifice together with them, so that we may make it clear to posterity that we have a memory of those providing services to our city. And this is actually interesting in terms of graphic display, because this is a document that actually has a title at the bottom. This is a decree about the people of Herbata, and it's just a genitive plural, a decree of the Herbatae, a decree about the Herbatae. And so what's interesting is that there is this reference to a war against the Carthaginians. And people have pointed out, people before me have pointed out, that this doesn't really make sense for a description of the First Punic War. The First Punic War was not in any sense for the people of Entella a war against the Carthaginians. And people are inclined to see this as being something earlier in maybe the late 4th century, something that was not necessarily recorded by Diodorus or Timaeus or any of the other sources that we might have. And when, what is the action of this decree, or what is actually happening here? Well, now that we're inhabiting our city, right? Now that we're here, they are making it clear to us that they remember what they did for us, right? And so in my reading, partially because there's been a fairly good but very circumstantial argument for the progression of Group A, and then Group B, and then Group C. I would like to imagine, or at least, I think it's fun to imagine, right, that word gets out that the people of Entella are thanking everyone who helped them, and the people of Herbata say to themselves, well, we helped you, but it was before, so can we get on this too? And the people of Entella say, yeah, sure, we'll do it. And this is similar to what's going on in C3. This is a document that has almost the same formula. The only difference here is that it mentions that the people of Gela, south coast of Sicily, they helped with horsemen and foot soldiers. And they also talks explicitly about a military alliance, a sumakia. But otherwise, it's exactly the same. And I think it falls in the same category, right, of word is out that Entella is putting, is giving out plaques, and they would like one. Thank you very much. So to sum up, let's see. I wanted to end here. Okay, and here's a map that just shows you the various partners. So Entella's here. Egesta is here. Some of the other the small communities who gave and lent grain are up here in sort of northwestern Sicily. I could show some slides to talk about the ones that we've identified if we like. And the other cities are here: Alcero, Herbata, unidentified, but up there, Gela. Gela was actually relocated to modern Licata in around 282, 280. So not clear which Gela we're talking about, but some community calling themselves the Geloioi. So that's similar feature, would be another talk. In any event, these decrees describe events that happened. They describe some kind of traumatic expulsion, right? We were ejected. We were wandering. It likely took place during the First Punic War. It probably took place in its earlier middle years when Roman armies were most active in that part of Sicily, but that's up for debate. The decrees also describe a resettlement that took place probably when the war was over, at least in the later final years, in the late 240s. Their first-person account of the war's impact on a small community is a rare and valuable evidence. The decrees can seem repetitive and interminable. Of course, you didn't think that tonight. But they're in many ways quite laconic and elliptical, leaving tantalizing gaps in our understanding and lots of avenues for further interpretation and further thought. So the particular avenue I want to highlight in the last section of this talk is the decree's active cultivation of their network of benefactors. Decrees are the ultimate speech acts. In the context of diplomacy, decrees publicize not only decisions, but also expectations. They thereby assign roles to other actors. Even a decree that just approves or commends something establishes the issuer's right and capacity to make a judgment. And even though we only have the decrees passed by the people of Entella, we should imagine a much more extensive exchange of communications, announcements, honors, requests, both before, during, and after this episode. The Entella tablets were certainly not produced in a diplomatic vacuum. In every case, the people of Entella, in thanking those who had helped or were helping them, intensified or solidified their relationship. So in this a little bit crowded, but it's sort of synoptic table, you see what each of these benefactors had before what I'm calling the trouble, what they did during the wandering period or the diaspora, what they did in the resettlement, and then what the decree does. And in pretty much every case, okay, maybe some of these things are not commensurable, right? How do you compare giving grain with potential citizenship? But in almost every case, and especially where there is a diplomatic honor or a diplomatic relationship, that relationship gets amplified, augmented, right? So the people of Enna had goodwill. During the wandering, they actually invited them and brought them in and gave them refuge. And so what do they get? They get that goodwill back, but they also get potential citizenship and presumably the right of shelter at Entella as well. Same thing with Egesta, right? They start with goodwill. In this moment of crisis, they respond and help save captives and return them to the community. So they also get potential citizenship, right? This thing that binds them potentially together. And we can talk about more of these. I won't sort of go on. This ratcheting up of relations is actually a common feature of diplomatic discourse in the Hellenistic Mediterranean. It's all throughout letters and documents written in the 4th, 3rd, and 2nd centuries and beyond, later with the Romans too, okay? But studied at least most contemporaneously to these documents, studied extensively for the Seleucid Empire, and particularly Antiochus III and the cities of Western Asia Minor by John Ma over 20 years ago, which is really a kind of an inspiration for my study of these documents. In this style of diplomacy, a favor creates an opportunity for giving thanks, and that expression for gratitude lays the foundation for a closer relationship and even more favors in the future. Here, the range of practical and symbolic honors, invitations to festivals, sacrifices, special privileges like potential citizenship, proxenia, alliances, official military alliances, and the more generic friendship and goodwill. They had the overall function of generating greater interaction at the individual and communal level between the Entellinoi and their benefactors. Now, we don't know how many people actually took up this offer of potential citizenship, how many people came to these sacrifices, how many came to the games, how many took their first row seats. We don't know how many were actually acted upon, but it would have the tendency to do this. So not only did the decrees tend to create and maintain friendly relations, the bronze tablets on which they were written played an important role too, embodying the relationships that the Entellinoi had depended on in the recent crisis, and they hoped to rely on if a similar crisis should a similar crisis arise. We have every reason to believe that the tablets did reach their destinations on the council house and on the Temple of Hestia, but we don't know how long they remained up there. As I noted earlier, they appear to have been stored in a stack or a couple of stacks together. So they must have been removed from public view. If they were ever put up, they must have been taken down. Entella remained inhabited under Roman control for centuries after its near elimination, into the early Principate, with little further documented disturbance. While we must, of course, be wary of trusting silences in the archaeological or historical record, I like to think that between the decree's effect of creating a stable network of benefactors and the imposition of the Pax Romana in Sicily, sort of first overseas province, the people of Entella enjoyed a long period of peace, if not actual prosperity. And at some point, they simply took the tablets down because they didn't need them anymore. The title of this lecture had promised lessons, so I will offer two, which you're, of course, under no obligation to accept. The first is the most obvious. In an unstable world, communities depend on each other for survival. We've seen that the people of Entella almost ceased to exist as a collective, even if the individuals could find a way to survive. And it was only with the help of others, small communities, large communities, individuals, that they managed to avoid complete dissolution. Those who were in a position to help, helped. Or some of those. I mean, we don't know how many people they asked for help and didn't get any. The second lesson is that gratitude can benefit everyone. The aid that the Entellinoi received definitely ensured their survival, but that could have been the end of the story, so to speak. Instead, the Entellinoi chose to take that opportunity to thank their benefactors publicly and to reciprocate in some way with favors that would pull them all into a closer orbit and a more resilient network of communities who could all count on support when in need. The Entella episode is a story of survival. The decrees speak concisely but powerfully about existential threat, the contingent refugee experience and food shortage, as well as salvation, connection, and an expansive sense of community beyond political borders. Thank you for your time and attention, and I would be delighted to answer questions. Yeah, I saw you first. Go ahead.
First of all, thank you for an excellent lecture. It's very enlightening. There are three features whose interrelationship I'm wondering about. First of all, that big granary. So we're in Western Sicily. It's been settled. Demeter is one of their goddesses. They're growing a lot of grain. Second of all, they have money to pay their debts, which means they've got some source generating this money. And third of all, they're offering citizenship as thanks. So my question is there an interrelationship? And in particular, what privileges did citizenship have? For example, did it give, first of all, right of refuge? But did it say, for example, get access to communal grain stores and that kind of thing? So there could be in a time of famine or not very ample grain somewhere else, the people who were now honorary citizens of Entella could get some grain from Entella's grain.
Yeah. Thanks for that question. It's a good one because, citizenship studies often have to do with large, like places like Athens. Roman people care about Roman citizenship. So one has to ask oneself, well, who cares about being a citizen of Entella as opposed to a citizen of Segesta? Now, I think that's partially because the biases of our sources and the way that we're all taught is to care about the elite of the elites and not the local people who might have been quite influential and things that mattered to people on a local scale. But it is what I sense behind the question is this idea that was potential citizenship an easy thing for them to give? Easy, right? Of course, costs us nothing. And I think there is probably some truth to that. We only know about the civic organization of Entella at this time because of these tablets. And they talk about a council and an assembly. They talk about, there's clearly some rotation of offices. Although again, we don't know for sure exactly how these were created in time. So, most people think of this as if not a radically democratic city, then certainly a polis on the kind of the standard Greek model, whatever that is, involving some right to communal resources, and the granary being in the Agra has to be a public resource. So I think there would be a very good case to be made that these honorary citizens or anyone who took up citizenship in Entella would have access to what was in the granary. And the issue upon returning is, of course, that if they've been away, there's nothing in the granary because it all got taken or eaten or spoiled. And they need time, right? You can't grow grain, in a day. Somebody should make up a saying about that. You need time for a harvest season, and so that goes into the calculation too of and scholars have pointed out, well, if you save 10% for seed for the next growing season. I mean, I don't know farming, so I can't tell you, but that would have been one of the biggest concerns is while they're in Enna or while they're wherever they are, they have some access to food. But it's like, all right, now we're going home, and you show up in your house and the fridge is empty. So I'm talking circuitously around this question. In terms of debts, I mean, are they paying? Maybe they're paying off their debts. Maybe they're repaying it, in this honorific fashion because that's what they can do. And I also don't think we should downplay the symbolic and the honorific, because if this shows anything, it's Entella today, Herbata tomorrow, right? And in fact, it wasn't only a generation later, and the cities of Sicily were once again choosing between sides. Many of them suffering, similar expulsions and depopulations and slave, so that's the direction that I would go. I think we don't have a lot to say when we don't have a lot of evidence about the economic situation at Entella, and I'm inclined to think of them as kind of getting by with what they've got at their disposal. That also happens to be a pretty meaningful thing in this world, because they, as I said 5 or 10 times, right, they only survive because of these helpers. If not for these other people, you would never hear it. You wouldn't have heard of it. We wouldn't have heard of it. Yeah, thanks. So a question here too.
So I'm wondering why Entella was a target. Is it strategically important, militarily, or the other communities around there apparently were not despoiled in the same way? So do we have any evidence of why they were particularly in the process?
Yeah, well, I can't switch as easily between all the slides as I would like to, but I'd like to. I mean, okay, probably that beautiful image of the hilltop is burned into your eyes, right? I mean, one of the things is that Entella is a very defensible site, so it would have been strategically important. Not that there weren't other hilltop sites in Western Sicily that were also important. in the written record of the First Punic War, we don't hear about Entella at all. And so, I'm tempted to respond that, as far as the Romans and Carthaginian armies were concerned, this was, at least in the beginning, this was small beans, like not important. Again, our sources are obviously biased and things have been compressed. And so just because Diodorus doesn't mention it doesn't mean it wasn't seen to be important at the time. But they talk much more about cities like Segesta, cities like Enna, at this time when Carthaginian and Roman armies are contesting town by town. I suggested, maybe people would take issue with this, but I think, the First Punic War is kind of a progressive, halting, process of city by city, more or less going over to the Romans. Some of them switch back, and it's complex, but that's kind of the best answer I can give. I mean, I think it's strategic, defensible sort of geography makes it an attractive place. And in that vein, I think of again the Achaemenid invasion, right? And this idea that you don't want to leave a stronghold empty for someone else to settle in. And so there is a river, yeah. I don't have a great map that shows. Well, yeah. So here you go. There's the river. The Chrymisos runs sort of just south of it. There's a branch that runs north of it, but mostly south. But it wasn't navigable as far as we can tell. So not important for trade or sort of personal access necessarily. Yeah, that's kind of the best answer I can give as far as like why they would be targeted. I mean, and the reality is that many others probably were, and we just don't hear of them. There are a number of unnamed archaeological sites in Western Sicily. I mean, no ancient city name, but a modern, a site that's been identified that could well have been part of this landscape. That I think that story is still being written mostly from the archaeological record because the historical one has so many gaps. Yeah.
What was the population?
I thought I said not to ask about that. The population, it's a good question, and it's a hard question because, okay, they're presenting themselves like a city-state, right? They're presenting themselves like a Greek polis, and what we don't know is, was the council, 5 people, and the assembly, 50, or was it, a population of several thousands? One of the ways, okay, I mean, ancient demography is very iffy. One of the ways people get at it, sometimes they look at a theater. Well, we don't have the size of the theater. We don't have a theater at Entella, so we don't know. The other thing they look at is just sort of urban area, habitation. We actually don't have any houses from this period, or they haven't been excavated, right? We have these tablets, and here I'll go up to decree A1 and I'll show you the uncertainty. Depending on how you read these symbols, I suggested, and it's only a suggestion, that you have either something like, let's see, yeah, you have something like 290 or 300, let's call it 300. It can all this grain that they took, it would have been enough for about 300 people to survive for a year, or about 1,100, 1,200 to survive for about a year. Now, there's a lot of us. I mean, does that mean that was the population? Well, maybe, but again, there's a question of how much grain does one need to hold off on to plant. There's a question of, do they need to survive for a year, or do they only need to survive? What time of year did they return? What time of year did they begin planting? Did they have to wait 4 months, 5 months? Did they have access to other food resources? This document even talks about money, right? And the individuals, let's see. Am I missing that? Where is that? Yeah. Yeah, that's right. Okay. They helped with grain or money or anything else. So is it possible, right, that there's other food resources or there's money that they can use to buy things? Yeah, so there's a lot of uncertainties here. But I think, we should not be thinking of 20,000 citizens and and an extra population of 80,000. Yeah, but this is not a giant city. This is a small city. Yeah.
Don't recall originating city is.
So it's not a Greek colony. It's a site that's inhabited from the Bronze, like evidence of inhabitation from the Bronze Age. It's a site that shows evidence of occupation all through, basically up through the Principate, up through the 1st century CE. But its origins are loosely Illyrioan, is what most people go for, which is the Western Sicilian indigenous population that the Phoenicians and the Greeks found there. But they're engaging with Hellenic culture at least, and probably with Punic culture too, in ways that are not really clear, given how little we kind of understand that process. Sometimes it's just totally ham-fisted, but we do what we can. People sometimes call it the sort of Punicization of Western Sicily, right? And but what it's naming is a complex process of interaction between indigenous, like people who have been there for centuries, and newcomers, right? And that happens on the eastern side of the island with the sickles. We know that's better documented, and it certainly is happening. Yeah, very much like that. Yeah, like the Rhone Valley, right? And places in which it's hard for the modern scholar to understand, because the very practices that were hybrid and could be interpreted multiple ways by the people living there at the time who just knew it. To us, they're mysteries, and we like to assign things, say this is Greek, this is not Greek. But I was alluding to this at points in the talk, but I don't think that's often the most helpful way to think about material culture or any culture.
One last question.
Please.
The dating of the structures.
Yeah.
What is the predominant base of the structure?
Most of the buildings that I showed, the monumental granary, that's built around 300. So the end of the 300 BCE, yeah. So built at the end of the 4th century, we have foundations from earlier, but it's hard to talk about what exactly that structure would have been. This is often the case, that the earliest things are the most poorly preserved. So by far the biggest sort of phase of construction is, let's call it late 4th century, early 3rd century, right around 300. Yeah, and then right. Go ahead. Yeah, you, and then we'll go to Brian.
I'm fascinated by the placement of the plaques on Temple of Hestia and the Proletariat Council House.
Yeah.
That does signal sort of oversight of these, what they're saying that the citizens should do in honor, right? Like one is a political oversight, one religious oversight, the Temple of Hestia. Does that tell you anything about anything more other than, well, let's just place it on Temple of Hestia here, or if it's purposeful and it has meaning, or it doesn't? I don't know. Yeah, it's a good question, and it reminds me to say something I didn't say, right? Which I said, like, look for Hestia later. Both oikoi, actually, the shrines with figurines from the just adjacent to the granary, have been suggested that those could also be Hestia. And I'm not an expert in sort of the religious iconography of goddesses. I know I know enough to expect Demeter and Kore. So unclear. The council house is also unidentified. We don't know where that was. But I do think that there may be something to that, because one of the other shifts, and I just put up this slide because it shows the groupings, right? These were all passed on the same day, and they all go to the council house. This goes on the council house, but these go to the Temple of Hestia, right? And they're all passed on the same time, and these are also the ones that are dated by Hierom Nomon, right? Which has that hieros root of the sacred. So it is certainly evocative of a more religious flavor, for lack of a better word, in those documents. And more than that, I mean, I would have to think about it a little bit more. It's interesting because also, right, these are the documents, these later ones are the ones that that are about what happens after they're back home. And the people of Asaro, right, help them out. And then the people of Entella say, well, yeah, let's make a decree for them. We're already home, but they're helping us. They're still helping us out. Again, C1 has that same language, providing services, kreos parechetai, just like totally anodyne. What are they doing? No idea. And then these other ones, right, are the other ones that I suggest are sort of people they want to be thanked too. They want in on this network. So I'd have to think a little bit more about that religious connection because it is, you're right, that it is there is a confluence of more religious flavor again.
Yeah, and that's that too.
Yeah, great. All right. Yeah, please.
Did every little town have a temple to about?
Great question. It depends what you call a town. Yeah, some kind of religious structure is to be found in any community for which we have a good name, likely. But there are plenty of sites in Sicily and elsewhere in the Mediterranean that have names but are described variously as a fort or as an outpost or as a hamlet or something. And so it's not clear. Religious spaces are not always clearly marked in ways that we can see 2,000 years, more than 2,000 years after the fact. And so yeah, there's that question. But yeah, we tend to think that most communities of people in the ancient Mediterranean had some relationship with some set of divinities. Sometimes ones that we recognize, other times ones that we don't. Often ones where what looks to us as the same typology of figurine could be interpreted multiple ways by different people. And then just lastly, I would say, right, on this issue of what's a town, the status of communities changes all the time, right? And cities don't just sort of come into existence and exist as cities and then not become cities. They change. I mean, we all know that cities change significantly over time. And that happened in antiquity too. So there were probably settlements of even hundreds of people with no obviously identifiable shrine. But that just means that whatever religious thinking and practice they were doing was just happening, somewhere where we don't get to see. Yeah.
Seems like it would be indicative of a community watching that.
Yes. I see what you're saying. Right. The fact that they have a temple of Hestia should suggest that we're not talking about a tiny group, right, of returnees. Yes, I think that's probably right. And I think things like the city infrastructure, having a council, having assembly, but also the religious architecture, even though we don't necessarily know what building that is, should suggest that we're talking about more than just a handful of people. Yeah, thanks.
Unfortunately, since we are sort of asked to vacate by 8 o'clock, we have to draw this to a close. But first of all, I'd like to do so by thanking our speaker once again. We will most certainly have him back at some point. Second, we have our drawings. We do 2 drawings at the end here. One for a set of books and one for a student membership. We're giving away, thanks to one of our speakers.